America built the most aggressive tariff wall in 80 years. The target was China. The result is something no one in Washington planned for. Canada just signed a trade deal with Beijing, slashing EV tariffs from 100% down to 6.1%. The UK's Prime Minister flew to China for a 3-day economic courtship. The EU locked in a massive deal with India. Finland, Ireland, South Korea, Germany, all lining up at Beijing's door. And here is the part that should concern every American watching this right now. These are not adversaries. These are the countries that spent decades inside America's economic orbit. They are leaving. Not because China offered them something extraordinary, because Washington made staying too expensive. The tariff strategy was built on a simple premise: punish China, force allies to follow. What happened instead is a structural fracture in Western trade alignment that is accelerating by the week. And if you have a car payment, a grocery bill, or a 401k, what happens next lands directly on your household budget. So where exactly did this go wrong? And what does it mean for the American economy over the next 6 months? Rewind to October 2024. Washington slapped 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada followed in lockstep. The EU launched its own investigation into Chinese EV subsidies. The Western Bloc looked unified. The message to Beijing was clear: your cheap cars are not welcome here. But then something shifted. Trump's second term brought tariffs not just against China, but against everyone. Steel and aluminum duties hit Canada at 25%. The EU faced reciprocal tariffs across dozens of sectors. By August 2025, Canadian goods were sitting under a 35% tariff rate. America was not just fighting China anymore. It was fighting the entire trading system it built. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos and used a word no Allied leader had used publicly in decades. He called it a rupture. Not a disagreement, not a tension, a rupture in the world order. Within weeks, he was on a plane to Beijing, with the first Canadian PM to visit China since 2017, and he did not go empty-handed. He went with a deal framework already drafted. Now here is what most people are not connecting. This was not a reaction to one tariff. This was a calculation. Carney looked at the numbers. 75% of Canadian exports flow to America, and decided that dependency itself had become the threat. But the question nobody in Washington is asking yet is this: what happens when your closest trading partner starts treating your biggest rival as the more predictable option? Here's what Canada and China actually agreed to. The tariff on Chinese EVs dropped from 100% to 6.1%, but only on the first 49,000 vehicles per year. That quota rises to 70,000 within 5 years. In exchange, China slashed tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% down to 15%. Tariffs on Canadian lobster, crab, peas, and canola meal all gone entirely through the end of 2026. The deal unlocks nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian farmers and fishermen. Beijing also committed to visa-free travel for Canadians and reopened discussions on Canadian beef and pet food exports. On the surface, this looks like a straightforward agricultural swap. Canada gets its farmers paid, China gets a foothold in the North American EV market. Handshake. Done. But this is where the story changes. Canada did not just cut a commodity deal. Carney announced that Canada would double its energy grid over the next 15 years, and invited Chinese investment into offshore wind. He committed to exporting 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas to Asian markets annually by 2030. The premiers of Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, 3 provinces that almost never agree on anything, publicly backed the deal. Western Canada saw this for what it was: not a trade adjustment, an economic reorientation. And while Ottawa was signing papers in Beijing, Washington's response fractured. Trump called it a good thing, said any country should make a deal with China if they can. His own trade representative Jameson Greer called it problematic the same morning. 2 signals from the same government on the same day. That contradiction told every Allied capital watching exactly what they needed to know. Washington does not have a unified position on the most important trade realignment in a generation. Here is what structurally changed and why it cannot be easily reversed. For 30 years, Western trade policy operated on one assumption: allies align with Washington on economic security, and in return they get stable market access to the world's largest consumer economy. That assumption just broke. Canada is not the story. Canada is the signal. Within 2 weeks of the Canada-China deal, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer landed in Beijing for a 3-day visit. He approved a massive new Chinese embassy in London that had been blocked since 2018 over national security concerns. Finland's prime minister visited Xi Jinping. Ireland's leader followed. The EU finalized a trade agreement with India that European Council President Antonio Costa called the mother of all deals, covering a third of global trade. And Germany's chancellor was already scheduling his own Beijing trip. Count that. 6 allied leaders pivoting toward Asia inside a single month. That has not happened since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, if you are watching this from the United States, and I know most of you are, let me tell you why this hits your life directly. The USMCA, the trade agreement that keeps 85% of North American trade tariff-free, faces a mandatory review by July 1st, 2026. That is less than 80 days from now. Canada and Mexico must decide whether to extend it for 16 years. And right now, not a single trade expert interviewed across 3 major publications believes that deadline produces a clean deal. If that agreement collapses or enters annual review limbo, the cost of everything from auto parts to dairy to building materials shifts overnight. And if you think that sounds abstract, wait until you see the numbers in Section 7. To understand what is actually happening, stop thinking about tariffs as trade policy. Start thinking about them as a sequence of forced choices, and track who is choosing what. Washington's calculation under Trump is not complicated. Tariffs serve as political leverage, not pure economics. The strategy since 1987, and Trump has been consistent on this for nearly 4 decades, is to use trade pressure as a forcing mechanism. Make the cost of resisting American demands higher than the cost of complying. It worked on Mexico in his first term. It worked on South Korea. It worked on Japan's automakers, who are now building more plants on American soil than at any point in history. But the strategy has a fatal design flaw. It assumes allies have nowhere else to go. Beijing sees this flaw with absolute clarity. China is not chasing these deals. China is simply holding the door open and letting Washington push its own allies through it. Every state visit to Beijing in 2026 reinforces the same narrative, that the country Western leaders spent years trying to decouple from is now the more stable, more predictable economic partner. That is not Chinese propaganda. That is Mark Carney, a former central banker, a G7 leader, saying it publicly on camera. And here is the layer most analysis stops short of. The Supreme Court struck down Trump's IEEPA tariffs in February 2026 in a 6-3 ruling. The legal authority behind the most aggressive trade actions of the past year was declared unconstitutional. The administration pivoted to Section 122, a temporary 10% global tariff that expires in 150 days. That means American trade policy is now operating on a legal framework with a built-in expiration date. Every allied government doing math on whether to align with Washington or diversify toward Beijing is factoring in one variable above all others. Can America even sustain this tariff architecture? Right now, the honest answer is uncertain. And in geopolitics, uncertainty is the one thing that drives realignment faster than anything else. But the other side tells a different story. Michael Pillsbury, senior fellow for China strategy at the Heritage Foundation, went on national television and said Carney is playing with fire. His argument is direct and worth taking seriously. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Canada's economy is structurally dependent on American demand in a way that no Chinese deal can replace. 49,000 electric vehicles is less than 3% of Canada's new car market. The canola deal, while meaningful for prairie farmers, does not offset the $700 billion in annual goods and services that cross the US-Canada border. In raw numbers, Pillsbury's math holds. Canada cannot replace America, not even close. And there is a deeper strategic argument. China has a documented record of not honoring trade commitments. The Phase 1 deal from Trump's first term, Beijing agreed to purchase $200 billion in additional American goods. It never came close to meeting that target. The canola tariff reductions are only guaranteed through the end of 2026. The pea and lobster exemptions have the same expiration. Canada is celebrating a deal built on temporary commitments from a government that has broken permanent ones. Here is where the gap in that argument sits. The opposing view assumes that the alternative, staying fully aligned with Washington, offers more stability. But the data no longer supports that. The IEEPA tariffs were struck down by the Supreme Court. Section 122 expires in months. Trump endorsed the Canada-China deal on Friday and threatened 100% tariffs on Canada the following week. Pillsbury is right that China is unreliable. The flaw in his position is the assumption that America, under current leadership, is any more predictable. When both options carry risk, countries diversify. That is not betrayal. That is portfolio management on a national scale. Now let me bring this directly to your kitchen table, because this is not a story about diplomats in Beijing. This is a story about what you pay at the pump, at the grocery store, and on your next car payment. Start with the numbers that matter most. The Yale Budget Lab calculated that tariffs currently in effect represent a loss of $600 to $800 for the average American household in 2026. For families in the bottom 20% of income, the burden is 2.5 times heavier as a share of their earnings than it is for the top 10%. Tariffs are not a flat tax. They are a regressive tax, and the people feeling it most are the ones least equipped to absorb it. Now layer in what is happening to consumer goods. Procter & Gamble raised prices on 25% of its product line, citing a $1 billion annual tariff hit. Coffee prices have climbed because companies like Smucker's planned 3 separate price increases in a single fiscal year. Auto costs are worse. GM absorbed $3.1 billion in tariff-related expenses in 2025 alone. Those costs do not disappear. They land on your lease payment, your insurance premium, your repair bill. And here is where the Ally realignment makes this personal. If Canada opens its market to 49,000 Chinese EVs at 6.1%, while American consumers face vehicles priced under tariff-inflated supply chains, the price gap between what Canadians pay for a car and what you pay widens in real time. Chinese EVs retail between $10,000 and $25,000 in global markets. Americans cannot buy them at any price. Your neighbor to the north now can. That is not a geopolitical talking point. That is a $15,000 difference on the same category of product sitting on the same continent. Meanwhile, the US-Iran conflict is pushing transportation costs higher across global shipping lanes, compounding every tariff-driven price increase already baked into the system. Businesses that stockpiled inventory to absorb earlier shocks are running out of buffer. Dollar Tree's CFO said publicly that freight costs tied to the Middle East conflict are now layering on top of tariff uncertainty. When the buffer runs out, the price tag moves. And it moves toward you. If this video is making you rethink what you thought you knew about who tariffs actually protect, hit that subscribe button right now, because the final section is where I lay out exactly what happens next. 2 scenarios, 2 timelines, and 1 deadline that arrives in less than 80 days. 2 scenarios, 2 timelines, 1 structural reality that does not change regardless of which path unfolds. Short term, the next 60 days. The USMCA review deadline hits July 1. 3 outcomes sit on the table. A clean 16-year extension, which no credible trade analyst currently expects. A revised agreement with tightened rules of origin and new concessions from Canada and Mexico. Possible, but the Trump administration has not even requested trade promotion authority from Congress, which limits how much can change on paper. Or, the most likely outcome, no deal by July 1, triggering annual review cycles that keep the agreement alive, but inject permanent uncertainty into $2 trillion in annual North American trade. Canada's former chief trade negotiator said it publicly last week. Time is on Canada's side because pressure on the U.S. economy is only increasing. That tells you Ottawa is not rushing to the table. They are waiting for Washington to need them more than they need Washington. That is a complete inversion of the leverage dynamic that defined North American trade for 3 decades. Midterm, 3 to 6 months. The Section 122 tariffs expire. The administration either finds new legal authority or watches its tariff architecture collapse for the second time in a single year. Meanwhile, Canada continues signing deals at a pace no one predicted. 12 trade and security agreements across 4 continents in 6 months. Carney heads to India in the coming weeks. The EU-India deal is already operational. The trade network forming outside of American participation is not theoretical. It is being built right now, agreement by agreement, handshake by handshake, while Washington negotiates with itself over which legal statute allows it to keep taxing its own consumers. Here is my honest assessment for you. The Ally realignment is not reversible by a single phone call or a single deal. The structural trust deficit takes years to rebuild, and every contradictory signal from Washington accelerates the diversification calendar in Allied capitals. The polymarket odds currently price WTI crude hitting $95 this month at 87% probability. Energy costs are climbing, consumer prices are compounding, and the countries America needs most to maintain its global economic position are actively reducing their dependence on American demand. This does not mean America collapses. That is not how this works, and anyone telling you that is selling fear. What it means is that the cost of American economic leadership just got permanently more expensive, and that cost is measured not in diplomatic cables, but in what you pay for groceries, gasoline, and a new car for the next 2 to 3 years. Drop a comment below. Tell me whether you think the USMCA survives July 1 or enters the annual review death spiral. I read every single one. Hit like if this changed how you see tariffs, and share this with someone who still thinks trade wars are free. They are not. They never were. I am Marcus Reed. The pattern is clear, and the next move is already in play.